Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of my 3-part Bionicle 2015 Winter Wave review. This one will focus on the Toa, the real stars of this show. We're going to do things a little differently than last time though. We'll go over a lot of the same things we do with the Protectors, just in reverse for the most part. You'll see what I'm building up to as we go on. As for things like the Skull Spiders, the boxes, the combo models and whatnot, I'll go over those in the third and final vid. I'm not gonna lie, this is gonna be a pretty long video as is. Just stick around, because I got a lot of things to say. Some of them quite unkind. You'll see why. Let's start with the masks, an essential part of any Toa. They're pretty good. They're a tad smaller than the original Kanohi, which helps make the new figures seem bigger while wearing them. Rather than sticking them in the Toa's mouth, you clip them to the sides of the new headpiece. And yeah, the Toa have actual mouths now, how about that? The new headpiece looks great, all shiny and full of clean lines and expressive angles and make them look pretty regal. Each Toa and Protector also comes with one of 2, soon to be 3, Brainstalk colors. The shape of the eyes looks determined, without being overly aggressive or mean looking. The eyes are also quite big, but I personally feel the Toa Mitru eyes were just a bit more soulful still. There's something contemplative and vulnerable about them. No? Just me? Alright. For that matter, they fit in just like the Metro Head eye stalks, with a pin through the side holding them in place. But these work a little differently. Just like in the early days, the Toa's masks are made to be knocked off. Hitting them hard enough from any angle will do the trick, but I think the idea is for the Skull Spiders to crawl around the head and pry the mask off, possibly by triggering the Brainstalk to fling the mask away. The only thing I don't like about these stalks is that once you've put the masks on, the light piping isn't very effective, at least for most of these figures. Most of the time I can't even see the eyes, though there are a couple of exceptions. It mainly depends on how big the eye holes are. I do think the masks come off a bit too easily, but it's not that big of a problem. They can be pretty tricky to pose without losing the mask when you grab them by the head, but they won't pop off just from shaking the figure a little too hard or whatever. The masks themselves look pretty great, mostly. Kopaka's mask looks almost like his original, with the 3 lenses and everything, though I'm not sure what they're for now. I expected this mask to look quite dull after seeing screenshots of it, but I actually love how it looks with the rest of this figure. He seems to be the most non-aggressive of the group, I think, which is interesting, given how strong he looks. The horizontal gaps on his forehead have been flipped upward, letting light shine through the top, giving this guy some great light piping. Tao's mask is another that really grew on me once I saw it in person. He's got the scowl, the fierce eyes, the grooves on the sides, but the addition of sleek new cheekbones and a sweeping jawline make him look a bit more grown up, shall we say. Like this is the next step in his evolution or something like that. I like the other little details they've managed to add in without making it all too busy like a cluster of random stuff. What impresses me most though, is a detail on the inside of the mask. Sweet Nobi, look at this. They really went the extra mile here, considering these are details you won't see most of the time. Oddly enough, the other Toa's masks don't have this level of detail, leading me to think they must have designed this one first, and put everything they had to making the best first impression they could when presenting it, maybe even going a tad overboard. Overall, I think this mask turned out the best, and is a good representation of what we can expect with the new line, a new face for Bionicle. Even after having it in hand, a newest mask took some time to grow on me, but now I love it. The mask is even smaller than the others, sadly leaving his head kinda bare, but it's really effective at making this guy look imposing. If it were much bigger, he probably wouldn't look quite as mighty, so I think it was a good move. As for the actual look of it, this is another one that strongly references the original Kanohi Pakari, and like Taho's new mask, it's nice to see it given what feel like actual facial features, where the original was admittedly kinda flat and full of holes, like, well, a mask. Don't worry, I'm not knocking the original Pakari. It's almost as iconic as the Hao, and probably my personal favorite Kanohi mask of all time. But it's nice to see how different they managed to make this one with all of its new little nuances and still make it look like a Pakari. It also has great, and I mean great, light piping. Palatu's mask harkens back to his Kanohi Kakama well enough, mainly with the intakes on the sides. The original mask looked kinda laid back, which fits his character, but this new one has smaller eye holes and generally looks more fierce and aggressive. I'm not sure how I feel about this, though it does fit the rest of him, and it manages to look pretty distinct despite being the element usually left to warm the shells back in the day. Galli's new mask has irked a fair bit of people, but personally I really like it. It looks very nautical, like something you'd see a crazy supervillain put on the front of his submarine. The mask itself doesn't look evil though. I'd say it looks pretty neutral in more sense than one. I've heard a lot of people complain that it isn't very feminine, and this confuses the heck out of me. Just how do you make a mask look feminine? Bedroom eyes, rosy cheeks, eyelashes? Some people will say Galli's original mask or Toa Nakama's mask look feminine, even Halimari's mask, but I found that those masks work just as well when worn by a male character, and this really is just more the same. She looks fine. As for harkening back to the original mask, it does so somewhat, with a shape around her eyes looking kinda like the goggles, and she has little details here and there that coincide with her original mask. It really doesn't look that much like it, but I'm okay with that since it's such a great design anyway, and I think it fits her character just fine. Probably the biggest departure of all, though, is Leiwa's mask. Yeah, it's got the underbite, the gaps in the mouth, but that's it. It seems to be the mask people like the least, and I understand why, though I wouldn't say it's downright ugly like some of them do. It just focuses more on practicality than flair, I guess. I'm not sure why they made it this way, but as different as it is, I actually like it. I think it makes him look like he's piloting something. Possibly himself. Again, this mask isn't for everybody, but I doubt they'd hate it as much if it was worn by some other Toa with a new name. I'd say it's the most daring, fresh mask of all, and it works. Just not the way people wanted it to. Along with their default mask, each Toa comes with a golden mask, yielding somewhat mixed results. I think Taro looks the best with his overall. It's one of a few things that make him feel kinda like Toa Lacan. The others look pretty good with theirs, though I'd say Kopaka looks the worst. I don't mind the gold armor as much as most people seem to. I like it because most of it is focused in this one area, and the white mask breaks it up enough that it doesn't eat the color scheme. That completely falls apart when you buy this golden mask. What was normally a delicate balance is now just a big heaping pile of gold that would probably look obnoxious even on the toe of light. I don't think it should surprise anyone that I leave the gold mask off most of the time, but I think they're a great addition to have for the sake of play, and most of them do look pretty good on their respective Toa. Overall, the masks are great. Before moving on to other things, I'd like to talk about the chest printings for a moment. A lot of people don't know how to feel about these, but as you probably guessed, I kinda like them. Maybe it's just a little weirdo kid in me thinking about the Slicers and their wacky printings, but yeah, this takes me right back to that. There's something more classy and not so random about these though, mostly. Each seems to be conveying something different, from Leiwa's wavy lines to Tahu's jagged crosses. There's something very tribal about them, like there's something the villagers themselves may have painted on the Toa to better represent them or something like that. Maybe these are their emblems. You can also see gaps in the armor here and there, revealing bits of a sort of chainmail underneath, lending credence to the idea that these Toa are wearing actual removable armor. Neat. The yellow on Galli's chest ties her body's colors and her weapon together nicely, even kinda going back to the water slicer of all things. Kopaga's is the most symmetrical and dignified looking. Poitu's, well, it's kind of all over the place, but it kinda works for that whole wastelander feel they seem to be going for, and I'm just happy to have a chest piece in such a rare color as this. Then there's Anua. His chest doesn't have a printing, just stickers. I understand why they're there, his chest is huge. Beyond that though, I think this is the best design of all. It's so decorative, so crazy, yet there's something about it that somehow makes perfect sense. And then there's the stickers on Kopaka's thigh armor. I was gonna leave these off at first, but I'm glad I didn't. But yeah, some people are even more turned off by stickers than printed pieces, and honestly, I don't see why. The great thing about stickers is that they don't ruin a piece that you may want to use for other things. Think about it, I've been waiting for years to finally get this mold in white. But if the markings were printed on, I wouldn't be able to use it for anything else, not without painting over it or something like that anyway. At least this way, if I ever wanted to ditch the stickers, I could. Or I could just get some plain white pieces on Bricklink. Same goes for a newest chest piece. Stickers create options. They don't permanently mar an otherwise serviceable piece. Yeah, they might not be as durable as printings, but they're less restrictive for mockers. Heck, you could say that about all the Toa's chest printings, though I don't mind it so much on them, if only because of the variety and the sense of purpose they have. Overall, I like these designs quite a bit. They add a lot of character to these guys and make them feel a little more like they're part of an actual world, you know? A culture with its own trappings and designs, which is part of what drew us to Bionicle in the first place. It's nice. Now let's talk about the weapons. If there's anything about these new figures that takes me back to the glory days, no questions asked. It's these. They're detailed, they're functional, and they're pretty inventive. Out of the 4 weapon types, 2 of them are used by more than one figure. For example, Galli and Leiwa both come with these feathery looking axe blade pieces that make really nice flippers and wings. They're good for conveying motion and seem to look great no matter how you put them on. My favorite thing to do with Galli is pin her flippers together, giving her a sort of mermaid mode. Her legs are very sleek and not that gappy, so this is very effective and I love how it shapes up. Leiwa's wings can be placed a few different ways, though I like him to wear them like this. Really gives him more of a presence, you know. However, this brings up an issue I'll touch upon later. Even just as weapons, these pieces look great, and they feel surprisingly different depending on how they're used. Leiwa's axes don't feel like Galli's axe split in 2, even though they basically are. All the technic stuff attached to them makes them feel like they're made to be used a bit differently, and it works out well because these weapons fit both characters. Poitu gets some of the most unique weapons I've ever seen, these boomerang thingies that can be adjusted however you like to convey how hard he's about to throw them, or make it look like he's just now whipping them out for a fight. They can also be attached to his feet, allowing him to skim along the ground, not so much flying as hovering. Considering his mask doesn't give him the power of speed anymore, I think this is a good workaround, giving him some means of quick travel over the smooth desert plains. In terms of simple engineering, I gotta say, Anua's weapons are the best. He comes with 4 of them. Right off the bat, you can see how easily they're used for different things. I love the shape of them, especially around the back end. As armor, they wrap over his chest and shoulders just right, and I love how flush they are with the heels of that hoof piece. Together they make this powerful looking splitting maul kind of weapon. They call it a hammer, but that's what it looks like to me. In this form, they're very reminiscent of Toa Wanua's drill shovel things, but split these pieces apart and they can be placed over his hands, having just enough pointy tooth-like shapes to harken back to Wanua's claws from Bionicle's beginning. They look great in all 3 forms, but I'm also pleased by how compatible they are with the new building system despite seemingly being made solely to make us think about the good old days. These rods on the front look enough like pistons, but can be used to clip on other pieces like jaws or toes or fingers, much like the bulky paw-like pieces used similarly in recent years. Heck, I'd like to see someone use these as a jaws of a rahi, that would be pretty cool. And the pins placed inside the holes make it easy to add different texture pieces over the top. Yeah, you won't be able to fit every texture add-on because of the ways they're shaped, but still, it's something, and I think it just proves how the old and new systems are more compatible than people may care to acknowledge. The sheer applicability of these new weapons is what I think gives them an edge over most of the weapons introduced in Bionicle's later years. I love Strax's axe, but it's just an axe. You can't really do much else with something like that. These though, this is what LEGO's all about. Another piece that's shared between figures is this new blade piece. It's huge and very reminiscent of Toa Lakan's swords. They even smush together the same way. While Tao uses them as, well, swords, Kopaka has 2 stuck together as a sort of shield. Some may not like it because it's not circular, but personally I think it's a big improvement over his older shields. It's so big, it has such a nice shape, and it can really cover up a lot of his body. More than that though, the details make it look grand, like he's part of a royal guard or something fancy like that. I also love the energy bolt looking pieces that can be fitted inside these. They give these otherwise static weapons a great elemental feel. Taohu's swords look like they have tiny flamethrowers inside them or something like that. And the way Kopaka's blend right into the rest of his shield make it look like it's at least partially made out of actual ice. Like it would be pretty gappy if anyone else used it, but he fills out that space with his element. Aside from that, Kopaka gets a spear, which while pretty plain, I think is appropriate and fits right in with the rest of him, complementing the shield quite nicely. This is just kind of a personal thing, but I like making him bash his shield like he's taunting someone, like, "Come at me, bro." Oh yeah, and gears are back, how about that? Some people don't like seeing Tahu and Kopaka sharing the same pieces like this, but personally, I really like it. I mean, they both used basically the same weapon back in the day. I like for these two to have some similarities, like they're 2 sides of the same coin or whatever people say, and the different ways this piece is used play into their strengths. Tahu uses them like fire, lashing out, reaching for the enemy. Kopaka uses them defensively, guarded and restrained. Tahu is outward, Kopaka is inward. It fits their personalities, and conveys how as similar as they are in some ways, whatever differences they do have make them complement each other especially well. I can see these two being rivals. Things only get better with their secondary functions. Tao's swords come together to form a giant surfboard that feels just right for a figure this size, while Kopaka's shield comes apart to form a pair of skis. With Tahu, what you see is what you get, and it looks great, but the best part about Kopaka's other mode? This. Yeah, as plain a spear as it is, it makes an awesome ski pole, even having a characteristic little nub at the end. I'm downright shocked that no one seems to have picked this up. I've seen so many people review this guy and not point this out, but it's the coolest thing about him and it works out perfectly. I showed this to one of my folks who loves skiing down trails, and when she saw him come to life like this, her face just lit up and she decided right then and there that this was her favorite one. It's not hard to see why. I get it that it would be better for him to have 2 ski poles, and as the upcoming Skull Slicer figure shows, it is possible to make 2 arms move the same way. But I'm pretty happy with what we got. It just looks so cool to see him actually skiing. You don't have to pretend in your head that he's doing it, you can just do it. As if there wasn't enough to love about these already very cool, very retro weapons with extra functions and everything, the Toa come with even more weapons, so they can still fight in these secondary modes. Gali still has a trident while wearing the X-blades as flippers. Leiwa and Tahu still have swords to fight with while surfing or flying. Kopaka still has his spear, Anua's claws are, well, claws, and Pawatu gets this, it's something. Possibly my favorite singular new mold released in this wave, and the true core of these figures is this. I mean, look at it. Yeah, this might look incredibly bland at a glance, but at its core, the new Gearbox is basically the same as a classic Toamata torso piece. This is where all the magic happens, but instead of being a giant wad of plastic with a clear purpose in mind, it's a much more basic take on classic Bionicle engineering. Stripped down to its absolute most basic, bare-bone elements, anything that could be cumbersome or hard to work around has been done away with, leaving a good base to build upon. There's a few helpful notches to hold the gears in place while you're putting it together, but they don't get in the way of anything else you might want to do with this thing. Everything I said about the Protector's weapons goes for this thing tenfold. Yeah, it's great for action figures, but there's nothing stopping you from building a truck around it or anything else that comes to mind. Unlike, say, this. It's just that easy to mess around with. There's so many ways to pile pieces on, and the figures are all built around it, giving them a lot of individuality that they just wouldn't have if they were really built like Hero Factory figures, as some people keep insisting. I mean, these are some really intricate assemblies for Toei-sized figures, and it makes me roll my eyes every time someone says these figures are too simple because they don't technic enough. Just take a look at Anua. Good lord! All of these parts clumped together. It's beautiful. This guy is more technic in him than any Toei of old. He technics even harder than his original form. You just have to look beneath the smooth plating and all that junk. So yeah, the Toei all have gears again. Whoop-de-doo, right? Well, if that doesn't impress you, this will. When you try to use them, this happens. That's right. The arms stay up. With the freedom this design has given them, the designers really went to town on these guys, adding even more gears and pins and balls and what's to give them more friction and strength than ever before. The way they work is kinda like pulleys. Each new one added takes stress off the other ones. The result of this is a figure that you can pose the way you want one moment, then bring to life the next, and then put back the way you want them when you're done. These gears work like a dream. Honestly, the actual ball joints are more likely to ever give out than the gears themselves. There is a limit to how much weight the gears can take, though. For example, if Tao has to hold his entire surfboard in one arm, it's going to be pulled down. As long as the weight is balanced between both arms, though, they hold up just fine. Even then, characters like Galley don't seem to have a problem holding weapons that are almost as hefty. Again, the strongest example, literally, is Anua. Not only does he have friction joints on his upper arms, but the gears are reinforced by a ball and sucker connection of all things. To me, this is Bionicle at its best. I just wish his wrist was as strong. Oh well. 3 other Toei swing both arms when the gears turn because each arm is connected to a gear. The other 3, though, only have a gear on one side, the other arm being locked. I can understand doing this to Kopaka and Galley with their singular weapons, but there's something about Bohatu that I'll get into later. I wouldn't say as a criticism, just something to think about. Thanks to the versatility of the Gearbox and CCBS in general, the characters have very different body types and styles that, at least in most cases, fit the characters as we know them. Tahoe is loose. Everything on him hangs down. He's got a very swashbuckly, even kind of laid-back look. In some ways he's all over the place, especially with his armor placement, which at least fits the appearance and nature of a fire eager to spread itself. At least I think so. Kopaka is the complete opposite. Everything on him goes up. Even his shoulders are slightly higher than Tahu's. He's very tightly wound, very centralized and closed off, which fits a character who likes to keep to himself. Yeah, he's pretty bulky, but again I think it fits his personality. Heck, just staying these two together you can see how different they are and how they complement each other. Another plus for Kopaka is the use of the normal CCBS torso piece's shoulders, left bare on most Toei, to attach these shoulder pads. Anua uses his to hold his chest plate on, but the rest of the Toei, yeah, it's not as big of a problem as I expected it to be, and they're pretty easy to ignore, almost hidden by the chest plates. But the way Kopaka works around it is simple genius, especially considering how easily this sort of thing could hinder the gear function, but doesn't really. Anua is, well, I think this speaks for itself. With his huge body and fairly small limbs, he's a tank. I also think he captures that old Bionicle look and feel better than the others. The vents on his chest match the ones on his mask, creating a really nice flow, and the shoulder armor is so greebly it looks like something straight out of the good old days. It really gives this guy some dimension. Plus, all the technic gizmos is packed into his body, and the evenly spaced out golden armor pieces give this guy a consistently more mechanical, piston-filled, textured look than most Hero Factory figures ever came close to. Very few parts of him feel too bare or smooth, as some would say. If you're a Bionicle purist who's curious about these new figures but just doesn't like the general CCBS look, I'd recommend picking this guy up first. He shows off all the strengths of the new gear systems, and being such a big compromise between old and new, he's the best one to introduce the new shells and bones and whatnot that have become standard without overwhelming old school fans. The others come close, they really do, but he's the only one I feel completely pulls it off. Lei was wiry. His mass is the most spread out. He's the most lightly armored, with long, thin, lanky limbs making him look very light and agile. The only thing about him that bothers me is that his gearbox is placed so high he can't look up very far. Placing it one peg lower frees him up a bit, but it ends up giving him less of a unique presence. He can stand just fine, but if you want to put him in any flying poses, he's not going to see what's in front of him. I do like the way he looks overall, and the head really isn't that big of a problem for me. It certainly isn't a deal breaker, and I can see they did what they had to with what they had to work with, but still, it is kind of annoying, seeing what a striking figure he is aside from that. Galley is one of the more basic Toei, but she's very subtle. What I mean is there's lots of little touches that bring out her femininity where there easily could have been none. Her thin waist, her smooth thighs, even her shoulder armor making her actual shoulders seem a bit more narrow. All of these touches work brilliantly. Even the chest plate ends up looking gender neutral enough to work just fine on a female character, and along with the shoulder armor, is very reminiscent of Samus Aran's power suit. However, I think this could only really be pulled off with a figure of her size. When I first saw screenshots of her, I was worried she'd look kinda weak standing next to the others, that she just wouldn't be that physically imposing. While she's not as tall as Tahu or as burly as Kopaka or as wide as Anua though, I think her proportions end up being some of the best. Her arms and legs are just the right length for some of those simpler looking techniques to work out much better than they would have on any other larger Toa. These blue pieces, for example, make her legs look more muscular and her hips wider than they would if the bones were longer. They're just more effective on a more minimalist figure like this. These pieces give her a very different sort of feel than they would have if used by her brothers. She's slender and athletic and looks quite strong. Her armor is streamlined and aquadynamic. She just works. Bottom line, as simple on paper as her build may seem, there's a certain genius to it that really brings out the best qualities of this system and gives Gali more character than a figure like this has any right to have. It's so easy to make her look feminine in almost any pose, and she comes off as surprisingly sturdy. This, along with some other touches we'll come back to in a bit, make Gali my favorite figure released this year. Then there's Pohatu, the runt of the litter. His build is the most basic. He has the lowest piece count, one of the simplest color schemes, and in some places is even built sort of like a protector. Naturally, you'd think this would make him my least favorite of the bunch, but I still really like him. Despite being a shorty, no taller than Anua, not nearly as hefty, he has a gruff underdog sort of appeal because of it that endears me to him. It's not that he has no character or very little character, he just ends up having a very different kind of character that isn't going to catch on with everybody depending on what they're looking for. He has a strong Wastelander kind of vibe, and reminds me of characters from Jak 3 with his messy armor placement and what gritty detail there is. Or is it messy? While I would have liked a little more brown on him, the silver parts do have a purpose. What I said about Gali also goes for this guy. Being the smallest Toa, these pieces make him proportionally more rugged looking than you'd think, with strong, lean, pillar-like legs. For his size, his proportions are pretty good, though the arms do hang back kind of far. Yeah, I don't mind this so much on the other Toa. I think it's amazing they've managed to cram so much stuff in such a small amount of space back there, and in the end it gives these guys more dimension than the comparatively more flat Hero Factory characters. On a figure like Pohatu though, this does start to become a problem. I guess there's nothing that could really be done about it, but he does look a little awkward in some poses because of it. Oh well. What I find most interesting is the arms themselves. Some find the asymmetrical colors and build strange, but again there is a purpose for it. Let's assume, for a moment, that the Toa's primary colors are a sort of skin, and the gold and silver bits are just extra armor. That being the case, one may guess that Pohatu's left arm, at least story-wise, is more heavily armored than his right arm. This implies that he's right-handed, and uses that as his throwing arm. This falls right in line with warriors in real life who would wear armor on one side, but leave their sword-swinging arm mostly bare, so that they could swing faster. The fact that only Pohatu's mostly bare right arm has a gear function seems to validate this. It may seem kinda silly to some, but I love little quirks like this. They make the characters feel alive by telling us a story about them, how they fight, how they carry themselves, how they approach others, what flaws they have, things like that. It might seem like I'm reading a little too deeply into this, but hear me out. Look at Leiwa. He has barely any armor aside from around his chest and on his lower legs. The knee pads and, well, shoes tell us that he wants to keep those parts of his body protected, because he puts a lot of wear and tear and stress on those parts. So he jumps around a lot, maybe even falls down sometimes. The lack of armor on the rest of him also tells us that, like Pohatu, he doesn't want to be slowed down by armor that doesn't fit his strengths in places where he doesn't need it, so he wears very little armor, no more than necessary, so he can move faster. This fits an agile, limber kind of character like him to a T. One more example I'll give is Kopaka. I'll admit, when I first saw him, I didn't like the silver torso armor or the seeming overuse of gold pieces. Looking at him now though, I think it works out great. Like I said earlier, most of these parts are concentrated around one spot, and it's broken up nicely by his white mask, and some other details layered over these parts. Even the silver torso piece works out though, much to my surprise. Like I said before, I imagine Kopaka being the most guarded of the Toa, always coming off as a steadfast straight man, always trying to be so cool, when really he may be hiding some deep insecurities, and doesn't want others to see his lesser qualities lest they think less of him. Pretending not to care what they think, when in actuality he cares more than he realizes. Because of this, having a character like him wearing so much armor to make himself seem less vulnerable works. Even at face value, these are surprisingly solid color schemes. I admit, I sort of expected them to be a little garish and maybe even kind of pukey, but now that they're staying together on my shelf, I'm almost floored by how beautiful and vibrant they all look together. They have that strong elemental feel that we all say we miss from the early days, more than many later, darker waves of Toa did. As much as these Toa have going on, they narrowly avoid having their primary colors dominated by another one as their 08 incarnations so easily did. Kopaka is still clearly the white one. Leiwa doesn't have that much green, but like Kopaka's gold, it's all clumped together in this one spot, like a big green stripe, and with his mask there's enough of it that it becomes his core color, as it should. Puatu is similar, most of his brown parts being kept close to his body, with most of the silver on the ends of his extremities. Beyond that though, the colors and armor placement tell us more about these Toa than some set descriptions could. Just think back on some of the things I brought up in the last few minutes. These aren't things I'd find myself talking about if I were reviewing the Toa Metru, or the Nika, or even most of the other figures from back then. We're not just talking about set design anymore, we're talking about character design. And it really shows the depth and potential of the appropriately named character and creature building system to make characters. The designers didn't need to tell us that Pohatu is right-handed. They didn't need to tell us that Leiwa is the most free, or that Kopaka is the most withdrawn, or that most of the Toa are wearing gloves and boots with such simple details as color choices. But they did, and I think that makes these figures remarkable. Most Hero Factory figures were either really uniform or kind of abstract and random. When they weren't all over the place, they were just dull. There wasn't much of a flow or purpose behind why they looked the way they did most of the time, even when they all tried to fit a sort of theme like in Brain Attack. They were just goofy toys. Piles of plastic arbitrarily slapped together in slightly new configurations with underwhelming gimmicks to help them get by for a little while longer until they could release the next batch of more of the same. These figures though, despite using the same pieces, the same system, they're used in such brilliant new ways that I don't think these feel anything like Hero Factory, not even close. For me, it's about more than just getting new molds, or how detailed or smooth the pieces are. It's about what you're trying to convey, and I just get a lot more from these guys than any Hero Factory characters in memory. Let's compare the token girl of each series, Gally and Breeze as seen in the breakout line. They each have a nice, unique, fairly gender-neutral mask. They both have striking, distinct colors that aren't typically thought of as girly. They use a lot of the same pieces. Heck, their legs are basically the same in terms of construction and length. However, at the end of the day, I'm more drawn to Gally, not simply because she's called Gally as if that means anything, but because as similar as these figures are in some ways, Gally just says so much more. Breeze is about as basic a figure as this size can get, at her core being pretty much the same as Furno and Raka, as most Hero Factory characters are. But Gally isn't like Leiwa, just like Leiwa isn't like Pohatu, who isn't like Kopaka, who isn't like Tahu, who isn't like Anua, who isn't like Gally, and so on. In the Hero Factory story, Breeze and the others are just robot frames that could be customized with new armor and weapons to fit any and every situation, giving them potential for countless interesting builds and character designs. Most of the time, though, they don't quite live up to that. Each is little more than an interchangeable shell of a creature that doesn't really have any identity that sticks with you. But Gally has that feel, as do all the Toa. They feel like distinct living entities, who are just fine the way they are. They don't feel like cheap clumps of plastic parts. They're more than toys. They're characters, on top of making great toys. All the features, all the gimmicks, and none of them detract from the characters. And that's what makes these guys great in my opinion. There's just smarter engineering going on here. However, before going any further, I need to address what is a lot of old school Bionicle fans' chief complaint with these figures. The fact that they have Hero Factory parts. I hate that term, and people who use that term really rub me the wrong way. It is the epitome of ignorance among Bionicle fans. The reason this term bugs me is because it implies that these pieces were made mainly, if not only, to be used in Hero Factory sets. That has never been the case. Hero Factory was simply the first line to use these pieces, but to say they were made for Hero Factory because of that is circular logic. LEGO has stated time and again that there's no reason there should ever only be one line of construction figures. For years they've wanted to make a system that felt as versatile and accessible as the good old LEGO bricks they're known and loved for, something that could be used to make action figures under any name, and feel more like something people would expect from LEGO. So that's exactly what they did, and are still doing, and will keep doing for the foreseeable future. Heck, these pieces have even appeared in more than a few Ninjago and Chima sets, because the more streamlined traditional look of these pieces makes them fit right in with the classic LEGO aesthetic. More often than not, if you try doing this with old school Bionicle pieces, it can easily start to look like something made by one of LEGO's competitors, or a surprisingly ambitious knockoff brand. When people complain about these new figures being too simple or whatever, they're not talking about the piece count, because as many have made it pretty clear to me, they don't care about the piece count. They don't care about the construction. They don't care about the whole building part, because for them, having more pieces doesn't equal complexity. They don't want an involving build, they just want a few huge pieces with lots of pistons and vents and other surface details and some technical elements holding them together. And I'm sorry, but this has to be the stupidest, most counterproductive attitude you could possibly have as a Bionicle fan, and especially a LEGO fan in general. Now look, I understand if you just don't personally find the sleek, smooth shell pieces appealing, that's fine. But if you can claim that purely superficial details can make a building toy more complex, regardless of how simple the actual building process may be, you're out of your mind. By that logic, you could look at any like 500-piece Star Wars set in recent memory and say they aren't complex enough because they mostly use traditional LEGO bricks, and those pieces don't have enough pistons molded into them. And by that same logic, you could also claim that a Galador figure is much more complex than traditional LEGOs because of the wrinkles in their clothing and skin. LEGO is about building, not just putting together a statue and admiring it because of how many pistons you can spot all over it, and these sets are quite intricately built. The elaborate gearboxes, the creative weapons that can be used in so many ways, these are things that make for a great building toy. And even as far as a purely visual style goes, they are kinda trying to meet us halfway. Not just with the new texture add-on, but with the extremely detailed weapons, the stylish masks, even older elements like the brain attack torso armor and more personalized touches like the chest printings. Yeah, we're not all the way back to Nico levels of detail, but why should we need to be? If anything, I think a mix of extra details and sleeker core parts give these guys a more solid silhouette, a more rugged shape that feels like they're wearing actual armor plating, and not leaving all their important bits exposed for all the world to see. Even if you just take a second to look at these, really look at someone like Tahu, you'll notice all these hard edges and angles and corners that make him look like he was chiseled by the gods out of a rock or something. These pieces aren't nearly as flat or characterless as people like to make them out to be. Bottom line, I just think people are wrong for dismissing these because of the building system. This isn't the Hero Factory building system. These aren't Hero Factory parts. They never were. These pieces are the action figure equivalent of the traditional LEGO bricks we've used for decades. Heck, just place a Bionicle piece, say a Toamata leg or a Nika shin, next to a Hero Factory part, and a LEGO brick. Which two of these three things look the most alike?
One of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong.
Yeah, they look sort of like LEGO bricks. And they're supposed to, that's kind of the point. And I know what some of you are thinking, that Bionicle shouldn't have to try to be like old school LEGOs. It should feel different, like its own completely unique thing that makes it special. Well, LEGO has never been about any particular part of it being special. It's about taking seemingly unremarkable base elements and making something remarkable and special and unique and new out of what you have to work with. Something you. Looking back at the Galador line, those felt like they were made by a completely different company, even including warnings that told you not to try mixing the pieces with other LEGO pieces, when LEGO is all about mixing things together and being compatible and whatnot. This completely flies in the face of anything that could ever make a LEGO product good. The line had so many pieces that were clearly made to be used as an arm or a leg or some other body part, and nothing else. And, well, to a lot of people, Bionicle was really no different. Of course they're wrong, somewhat. But so many of these pieces were designed with a clear function in mind, a certain correct way to use them. When LEGO has never been about that, never been about doing things the right way. Believe it or not, Bionicle got a lot of flack back in the day from AFOLs, adult fans of LEGO who only wanted to play with bricks and felt that Bionicle was going to ruin the LEGO they grew up with. To them, these characters we loved because they looked so darn cool, completely betrayed those classic ideals and design philosophies that made LEGO what they are, and were the antithesis of everything LEGO stands for. They hated the super detailed, hyper-specialized pieces that were clearly made to be used as an arm or a leg or a chest plate, and little else. Starting to see a pattern here? This is why they call the Bionicle figures we loved cheap knockoffs or not real Legos. The same things that old school Bionicle fans seem to think somehow don't sound just as silly when said about these new Toa by them. You guys are becoming the new AFOLs, when this system was made to bridge the gap between us and the AFOLs, to make action figures that feel like Legos. Or to put it more bluntly, it was made to shut those AFOLs up. Just like the seemingly bare-bones Gearbox that ends up being more useful for it, these pieces, because they're more basic, are more usable and can be used in more ways. They're made to be popped on, popped off, and put back together in any number of ways you can think of over and over again in endless combinations, just like, as AFOLs would say, real Legos. These new toys don't feel like something produced by a completely different company with its own goals in mind and rules of play that go against LEGO's own ideals. These pieces, this system, it all behaves more like a proper LEGO product. Whether or not you think these particular figures suffer because of this, LEGO was trying to make something that's simply more faithful to the way they like to do things. And to that end, in the process of making a lot of compromises to give these guys some more pizzazz and detail and charisma or whatever, they have certainly succeeded. Aside from a few of the new bells and whistles that I do appreciate, CCBS feels more like a true LEGO product than the Bionicle of old ever did. And I'm not saying I like this system more because of it, I'm just acknowledging that that's what LEGO was trying to do, and they've done a good job of it. Whether or not you think trying to make Bionicle figures that feel more like normal LEGOs is a good idea or not, it's pretty clear that whatever they set out to do, they've hit the nail on the head. I understand that Bionicle has never been about being able to build a house or whatever with the pieces you get with the Toa. It's about making characters to act out adventures with. But that purpose is kind of defeated when the characters have generally the same build, or in the worst cases are essentially color-coded clones of each other, who are all built pretty much the exact same way, and only made to be built that way. The problems we faced back then, that we were more comfortable with because we just didn't know any better, and continued to convince ourselves weren't really problems at all, have been fixed by this new system. Despite using so many of the same pieces, these base elements, there's so many ways to use them, just like real Legos, that it's easier than ever to make a figure look like, well, whoever you want them to be, helped largely in part by the extensive integration of Technic pieces, like in the good old days. Heck, try mixing some of these new pieces with older Bionicle components and see what you can come up with. Don't let people discourage you by telling you you're a bad mockist if you use these pieces. That's just them being ignorant and dumb. Look, I know how confusing this all must be. I understand how some of you guys feel. Bionicle, your childhood, your escape, abruptly ends. Without any warning, the rug is pulled out from beneath your feet, and you break your nose on the ground. And when you look up, you see Hero Factory laughing at you. A lot of people think Bionicle was cancelled just so that Hero Factory could come along and replace it, that they were getting Bionicle out of the way for it, that Hero Factory killed Bionicle. But that's just not true, guys. You've got it backwards. Well after it was decided that Bionicle would be cancelled, Hero Factory was made to fill the void for a little while, until a new system was developed and they were ready to bring Bionicle back, not the other way around. But a lot of people tell themselves otherwise because it's fun to be mad and never let go. It's fun to be ignorant and make up a bad guy so you can vent all your frustration at it, isn't it? And for bitter old school Bionicle fans, Hero Factory fills that role. No matter what info you throw their way, they'll always tell themselves that Hero Factory killed Bionicle, and that it's now masquerading as what they love, wearing Bionicle's skin as a pelt, that they're Hero Factory toys, only Bionicle in name. Of course these Toa look sort of like Hero Factory characters. That's inevitable. And of course there are people who can't look at these things and not get angry. But this is no different than saying Star Wars sets and Chima sets look too much alike because they both use, well, bricks. Guys, it's time to stop thinking this way. It's time to come to your senses and stop letting your personal hang-ups from your childhood warp your perception of today's toys. Yes, these pieces aren't quite as artistic as older pieces were, but it's not because LEGO's lazy, and these pieces aren't cheap. They're strong and durable, made to be played with in various new ways without ever having to worry about them breaking as older pieces were so prone to doing after using them once or twice. As I keep saying, they're made to be played with like Legos, unlike the Toa of old, which played very differently. You know, believe it or not, I don't want to spend all day picking on people for not liking the style of these new Bionicle figures. I'm just going to look back at my own childhood for a moment because I can do that without letting my nostalgia affect how I feel about things being made today. This is Toa Vakama, with some modifications. He's my favorite Bionicle set of all from its original run, followed closely by Matao and Galimata. And as the years have gone by, as other figures have come and gone, and I've learned more about what goes into designing a toy and things like that, I've only grown to love them even more. Not out of nostalgia, but a growing appreciation for all the little things they got right. Ever since they were released back in 2004, the Toa Metro have been my personal favorite Bionicle figures of all, the pinnacle of what I like to call slicer engineering. Way back when, we saw a lot of experimental things like the Slicers, otherwise known as the Throwbots. Now the Slicers were cool and all, but they were basically a walking gimmick. They were built around functions rather than style. I still find their awkwardness kinda charming to this day, as a lot of people do. It makes them kinda unique, but let's just say they had a lot of evolving to do. Then came the Toa, which for all intents and purposes were essentially more dynamic, upright standing, streamlined slicers. They still had the functions, but now they were faster and had more action and looked like they really meant business. Then they were made even more streamlined as the Toa Nuva, and then came along the Toa Metro, who looked great, had lots of posability, and they still had the gears, but now they were better hidden and didn't feel like they could just fall out at any time. Overlooking the hit-or-miss Hordika, slicer engineering basically died after this. The Bionicle focused entirely on style and posability. The gearboxes and all those other hallmarks of the slicers and early Toa abandoned, and this would become the standard for the remainder of Bionicle's original run. Now, I loved the Bionicle when they were first released, and I'm not saying these figures have to have gears to be good, but for me, slicer engineering is all about trying to find a rarely touched middle ground between form and function. Figures that look really cool, but don't have a lot going on, or figures that do have a lot going on, but suffer in other respects to make that possible. And to me, the Toa Metro were the most successful Bionicle sets in that regard. They were the best example of slicer engineering. They still had some flaws, mostly this, but they were good. They almost hit that perfect sweet spot between appearance and functions. They were posable, they were stylish, they did things. They had a little of everything that makes me love Bionicle. And for all these years, I've clung firmly to my belief that these were the closest this system would ever come to being perfected. Since 2004, I've had yet to get my hands on a figure that could rival the sheer elegance of the Toa Metro and more effectively embody the strengths of construction figures. Until now. These figures simply have it all. They have multi-purpose weapons, they have involving builds, different builds, varying body types, they have vibrant color schemes, they all look different, they have the posability, they have the working gears, the arms stay up when you let go of them, they even have a good amount of that classic flavor, at least enough for me. They've finally done it. They've made a near perfect construction figure. Even the failings of the splendid Toa Metro have been fixed. They've covered all the bases. They've made a toy with barely any true failings whatsoever, beyond a personal distaste for the style some people are bound to have. Bravo, LEGO. You finally made something that I can honestly say is an even better toy than the greatest toys of yesteryear. I mean, look at this. How can any of you people say this is the same as this? Like, just look at how far this system has come. Look at the advancements that have been made. What a cool toy this is. It's apples and oranges at this point. This system and the ways it can be used have grown and evolved so much since it debuted with these little guys that I simply cannot say they're comparable in good conscience. So many innovative changes have come with the Toa that they've basically become a completely different sort of toy than the short-lived heroes were. They stand for radically different things, different ways to play. Yes, they use the same system, but it's used to greater effect here. These new sets show the potential this system has, even how easily it can be mixed with other systems, and they simply blow Hero Factory out of the water in every possible way I can think of. So much thought, so much care went into designing these sets, not just in terms of structure, but in giving each character their own flavor, telling a story about them as you build. The play value is through the roof, and there's no reason for the kids of today not to love these. And that's probably the most important thing to remember here. Yeah, Bionicle probably wouldn't exist at this point if not for us, but we can't keep a toy line like this afloat by ourselves. If Bionicle is going to continue to remain viable, it needs to catch on with today's kids, which is getting harder for most toy companies as more and more kids stop playing with toys and permanently glue themselves to their iPads with their Angry Birds and their Flappy Birds and all other manner of birds. Now, LEGO is faring better in that regard, because they aren't most toy companies. But the point stands. If the new kids don't like this, it dies. They can't make toys just for us. That said, I do appreciate the lengths they've gone to appeal to us with the masks, the gears, the bits of new armor, and the creative new weapons. And look, I do hope that in future lines, they give us more new elements like the admittedly scant few seen so far to bring back more of that old school feel without downplaying the strong points of this system that make it so great for building. They've made some compromises so far, and there's no reason not to expect them to continue down this path they've started on, even if only for the sake of appearances. That said, expecting them to dig up and rebuild all of those old molding machines they scrapped and start manufacturing glorified Toa and Nika figures again is just a pipe dream. If you want more of the old Bionicle, get them on Bricklink like I do. You can get a Toa Metro for like $5 there. And as for the price of these, it kinda hurts, considering these guys really aren't even as big as a toe of Bionicle's Twilight years. $13 for one of those, 15 to 20 for one of these. But you know, you're not just getting a dime a dozen snap-together figure here. You're getting the gears, the crazy weapons, 2 masks, and a skull spider. Heck, a figure like Anu is actually a fair bit heavier than most of Nika builds given all the junk that's been crammed into him. You do get a much higher piece count than before. You do get more intricate, complex builds, and there are other things to take into account, like just how much stronger CCBS pieces are made to be than a lot of older pieces. Even disregarding inflation, I'd say yeah, it's worth it, even if just barely. And it's not just because of the parts count or whatever. It's the character of these things. They have more play value and more life to them, more of an edge than Hero Factory ever did, even at its best. Now you guys can still call me a traitor because you don't like Hero Factory parts or something totally lame like that, But to those with an open mind and an appreciation for well-designed toys, go get these. Right now. Any one of them. Maybe Galley to start with, or Anua. Then Tahu and Kopaka. Heck, just get them all. They're amazing. Enough said. If I haven't convinced you, then I guess nothing will. Your loss, man. Anyway, guys, I'm sorry this video ended up being so long. I just had so many things to cover, so many things to express, and even then I don't think I quite covered everything that I really wanted to. But this is part of why it took so long to make this video. It's just that I had so much work to do. And I don't usually ask for things like likes and faves and subs and whatnot, but at the very least, I would appreciate if you guys could share this video with the likes of Jangbricks and Logomation Studios, those guys. I really want to see what they make of the things I express in this video. See, if they agree, because I think I may have said a lot of things that have been on a lot of people's minds lately, and I may have even changed a few opinions in the process, who knows. I hope I've been able to make people appreciate CCBS a little more. I hope I haven't, turned them off completely. But yeah, I guess we'll see. This is one of the hardest videos I've made in a while, and I hope it was worth it. If you've sat through the entire thing up to this point, congratulations! And thanks. Toodles!